So as I mentioned earlier, we go through, I believe, 5 entire weeks with this magnificent chapter 6 of St. John's Gospel. And of all the 69 verses of that chapter, this section we have today is the most in your face, the most explicit and direct, about Jesus speaking about feeding on. I mean, it's a very coarse word that he uses. It's not the usual word for eat. Whoever feeds on my flesh and drinks my blood abides in me, and I in them. They have eternal life, and I raise them on the last day, and they have life because of me. But it's the Eucharist, what we know as the great treasure of the Church, and of our faith, and of our religion. Nonetheless, we always have to, well, precisely for that reason, we have to ask ourselves, well, just what use do I make of this? As one person says very well, what use is the real presence of Christ if we're not really present ourselves? Presence is mutual. And what good does it go to communion if you don't have the effect of it in your life? Paul goes so far as to say to the Corinthians, whoever eats and drinks the blood, eats and drinks unworthily will be liable to judgment. So, what are the effects? I mean, we see people, perhaps ourselves often enough, just going to communion and we're not even aware of any change of our consciousness or of our life. But I think in order to really profit from the Eucharist, we have to broaden our appreciation of where Jesus, the wisdom and the Word of God, is present, how we can eat his flesh and drink his blood in a real sense outside the Eucharist, or as an extension, if you will, of the Eucharist. Spiritual communion, they sometimes called it in the past, but it's more just this presence of Christ, presence of the Spirit everywhere. Look at the suggestive verse, this beautiful verse we have in the second reading, where it says, "Don't get drunk with wine, but be filled with the Spirit." That's what we should be doing. It almost carries over this Eucharistic metaphor of the wine and the blood and getting drunk on the blood of Christ, as St. Ignatius of Loyola says in his famous prayer. Carrying it over to getting drunk on the Spirit. I'm fairly sure that's the inspiration for the famous line of St. Ambrose's hymn that we sang every day in the monastery. One of the verses goes, "Today may we drink with joy the sober drunkenness of the Spirit." So we should be getting high every day on the Spirit, the sober drunkenness of the Spirit. It's a high, it really is. And we should be experiencing that as a way of transforming our consciousness, transforming our life, giving us joy so that we can give joy to others. But notice, be filled with the Spirit. And the Spirit is something we receive in baptism and in all the sacraments. In fact, we receive it, we should be receiving it every moment of our lives. Today, if you hear his voice, harden not your hearts. The Spirit is within us and is constantly inspiring us, getting us drunk with inspirations of love and joy and peace and pardon and justice and truth. This is what we should be living. That takes us back to this, again, a very famous passage in the first reading from Proverbs 9, where wisdom, personified as a woman, and take note of that, please. Wisdom is feminine in most traditions and most languages. It says that she's built her house with 7 pillars, and set up a table, and prepared her food, her meat, and slaughtered her meat, literally it says in Hebrew, and mixed her wine. So of course, obviously, the fathers of the Church and the early Christian community saw that as a prefiguring of the Eucharist. But notice it's in the language of wisdom and of the Spirit. The Jewish community understood this, God's wisdom nourishing us, before we even had Jesus or the Eucharist. So again, it's a reminder that we have Jesus, the wisdom of God, the Spirit of God in our lives constantly. The 7-pillared house, or the 7 gifts of the Spirit. The first primary gift is wisdom itself, the wisdom of the Spirit. Oftentimes the wisdom was seen by the fathers as the Spirit herself, or Christ himself, as Paul says, treats Christ as the wisdom of God and the power of God. So these forces, these persons are at work in our lives all the time, and they should be having an effect in our lives. So what kind of effect? What are signs of the Spirit? We know the fruits of the Spirit: love, joy, peace. But how do we exercise this? What are some good circumstances? What are some good recommendations? It says, the first reading says, we should learn. Those who lack understanding should find the way of understanding. The other gift of the Spirit, understanding, both in the Jewish and the Christian tradition. It actually says in Hebrew, those who lack heart, listen to me. So we've got to open our heart to our lives and to the operation of the Spirit. And if you read on in the Psalm today, where it says, taste and see that the Lord is good, tasting at every moment, not just in the Eucharist, it has a moral exhortation which follows here. It says, who is the one that seeks life and desires to see good days? Well, I hope we can all say, me. I'd like fullness of life and to see good days. So it says, okay, refrain from speaking ill and speaking deceit, which is harder than you think. Not just gossip, but the constant deceit and deception, denial that fills what we say and see and speak in our lives. That requires effort. It says, leave behind bad, pursue the good. Kind of vague. But then it goes on to say, seek after peace and pursue it. One of the fruits of the Spirit, peace. So once again, how do we get that peace? How should we respond in our daily circumstances to achieve or to be gifted with this peace? So the second reading gives us a clue then there too. It says, using that same imagery of wisdom, it says, if you're foolish, be wise, not foolish. Get to know the will of God. Again, well, what is that? But then it does give us an excellent clue. An excellent exhortation. After it says, be filled with the Spirit, it says, sing gratefully to the Lord, give thanks to God the Father through Jesus Christ, always and everywhere, in every circumstance. Wow. Now that's a challenge. But that's exactly the key to peace in our lives and among us, if we can in every circumstance give thanks to God for whatever happens to us. In the faith, the inspiration of the Spirit to help us see that no matter what happens to us at any time, it should be cause for thanksgiving. Seriously. To have that kind of faith and trust in God that no matter what happens to us, He loves us so much, the hairs of our head are all numbered. Don't worry about tomorrow or today, what you'll eat, what you'll drink. Whatever happens to us, God is loving us and God is bringing us closer to Himself. And sometimes that'll be painful. If you need any proof, there it is. But into your hands I commend my spirit. We can trust in God's action in our lives no matter what happens, including or especially on our deathbed. Give thanks. We don't cling. We don't complain. We realize that no matter what happens, there's this famous book in a French Jesuit, de Caussade, that says that whatever happens in each circumstance, trusting in divine providence, we can be sure of God's love and be grateful for whatever happens. That is a tremendous challenge, but it's not just Christians that see this. That's one of the key truths of Buddhism, for example, as you may know. Second noble truth is that so much of the suffering, the insufficiency of life, which is the first noble truth, is caused by our clinging, by our desire, by wanting it to be different than what it is, by our complaining. I want this and I don't have it. I have this and I don't want it. And we go on and on about the way we see things, the way we want it, with our tiny little egos, with our tiny little vision, and our narrow minds and hearts, and we think we know what's best for ourselves or the world. How do you know your disease isn't bringing you closer to God? It should. It's not a punishment, it's something. Not whatever happens, good or bad by our silly standards, is nonetheless meant as a pathway to God and is included in a bigger picture that He has for the whole universe. You're fitting into a picture you don't even understand or can't even imagine, which is what the opening prayer said, by the way. To bring us to a place we can't even begin to imagine. And that's what our lives are. Even I was on a family reunion the past few days, and my brothers and sisters were saying, we were discussing at one point, they're not churchgoers, most of them. And they've reached that level of wisdom too, that we were actually saying, at any one moment of your life, you can choose how to react. You can make yourself miserable by playing the victim, complaining, and wishing it were otherwise, or wanting this or wanting that, or you can breathe and count your blessings and see what's around you and within you, and no matter what, you can give thanks. You can be happy. It's your choice. It really is your choice. Nothing can happen that can make you unhappy. You will make yourself unhappy by your reactions. I mean, it's just very simple wisdom, but how hard it is to live it. And then we can give thanks to God. I conclude by pointing out that St. Therese of Lisieux, whose statue is over there, used this first reading as one of the key passages that inspired her whole spirituality. She loved these first few verses of Proverbs 9, where it says, whoever is simple, whoever lacks understanding, come in here. And her whole spiritual childhood, which is difficult, it's quite mature, was taking each circumstance, each little event of our lives, and living it as God would have us, seeing it as God sees it, being inspired by that spirit of wisdom to give what's necessary, receive what's necessary in each circumstance. So if she's irritated by one of her fellow sisters while they're doing the laundry, which happened, she's giving thanks and receiving the spirit of wisdom and love and expressing joy and kindness and compassion right in the midst of that irritation. At each moment you have the choice to spread love and forgiveness and joy, or to be nasty and grouchy and curmudgeonly. It really is our choice. So today, if you hear his voice, harden not your heart. If you want to know the will of God, what is God asking you to do right now in front of this person in front of you? That's the will of God, and that's the key to happiness, the key to wisdom, the key to joy, and the key to being intoxicated with the Spirit at each moment. So that's really practical wisdom. Don't be carried off and swept off your feet by your knee-jerk reactions. Do your soul work. Do some reupholstering. Let the Spirit reupholster you. Redecorate, redesign, so that you can begin to react with gratitude, joy, and peace, and pardon, and love, and compassion in every single circumstance, no matter what happens in your life.